Hi everybody, it's your human anatomy and physiology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are continuing our fourth unit in the skeletal system by discussing the gross, anatomy of a bone. Well, of bone structures, because if you really think about it, every single bone, she's got 206 of them when you're an adult, is by definition an organ. If it's made up of multiple different tissues acting together for the similar purpose, it is thus an organ. By the way, I'm in my basement right now, so if you are confused about my whereabouts, seeing that I'm not in my classroom, that's where I am. So without further ado, let's get going here. So in order to discuss what's called remodeling, bone remodeling, which is going to be the topic of our next video, how your bones are able to grow and repair themselves, we have to get an understanding of the makeup of a singular bone, which is what we're going to discuss today. And in order to discuss the makeup of a singular bone, we have to discuss the classifications of different types of bones. So that is where we will start this video, is by classifying bones. And there's 5 different ways to do that. Let's discuss. We classify bones in our body based on shape, and there are thus 5 shapes: long, short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid. So they're all pretty much aptly named. So if we also give examples of each of these types of bones, then we really can have an idea of where these bones are and how they're shaped, and maybe even why they're shaped. All right. So number 1. Long bones. This is actually the type of bone that we are going to discuss the most, seeing as we are going to fill out a diagram of a long bone and discuss the anatomy of a long bone later on. They're aptly named because they are longer than they are wide, and long bones are typically found in the upper and lower limbs. So your arms and legs, your most famous bones like your humerus, radius, ulna, your femurs, your tibia, fibula, those are all long bones. So that's what we're going to look at later today. Short bones, in fact, are short. Can you believe it? They do not have a long axis, and examples of short bones are really your carpals and your tarsals, which are your wrist and ankle bones. So you actually have a lot of your bones, a lot of those 206 that we previously mentioned, a lot of those are found in your hands and in your feet as well. So a lot of those are short bones. Flat bones are flat. They are thin and they form what's called the roof of the cranium. So like this temporal bone, frontal bone, occipital bone, parietal bone. Those are all flat bones that make up your cranium, the top of your head. Your ribs are actually flat bones as well. If you ever take a look at ribs up close, they are kind of flattened out. And finally, your breastbone, or your sternum, that's also a flat bone. So the ribs and the sternum, their responsibility is to protect your heart and your lungs, right? So they're flat in order to kind of like form a shield around your visceral organs there. All right, 4, if they're not long, short, or flat, they're irregular, meaning that they could just kind of have whatever shape. This is kind of a mixed bag of bones. So a lot of your skull bones, a lot of your facial bones are irregular bones. Your face is irregular. You got your mandible, you got your maxilla, your zygomatic bones, your lacrimal. Those are all different irregular bones, and they're not really long, they're not really short, they're not really flat. So that's the kind of category they devolve into. Your pelvic girdle, so your ilium and ischium down here, these are irregular bones. You might kind of think they're flat bones, but they're categorized as irregular. They're kind of like curved a little bit. And a really important one is vertebrae. Your vertebral column is all made up of 26 irregular bones. So if you ever take a look at vertebrae, they're irregular. They're not really falling into the other 3 categories. And then finally, the 5th category, it's a type of short bone, but it's embedded into a tendon. And the primary example of a sesamoid bone is your patella or your kneecap. So our friend right down here, it's in between the femur and the tibia, but it's embedded into a tendon. That's called a sesamoid bone. So it is a type of short bone, but based on where it is, that kind of gives it an extra classification. Okay, moving on from there, let's discuss the 4 layers of a bone, because a bone is an organ. We talked about this. So every organ seems to have some kind of membrane or outer covering on it, and the outer covering of a bone is called the periosteum. If we break apart that Latin word, peri, like perimeter, like pericardial, it means around, and osteum refers to bone. So that's the kind of a outer covering of a bone, and just deep to the periosteum, we can find compact bone. And compact bone is, it's a type of bone tissue that we discussed in our last video. And beneath that, or deep in that, is the spongy bone, which lies beneath the compact bone. We discussed that in our last video too. And inside all of that is where we can find bone marrow, and that fills the gaps in between spongy bone. And it's also found in what's called the medullary cavity within the middle of a long bone. A yellow bone marrow is found within the medullary cavity. Red bone marrow is found in the gaps in the spongy bone. All right, but either way, we can find bone marrow kind of deep to spongy bone, and this is generally how the layers of a bone work. All right, so with that, we're going to discuss the anatomy of a long bone. So does anybody know what long bone this might be? Any identifiers here? Well, this is the humerus. So this is going to be this bone right here, makes up your upper arm. All right, so let's get started. We are first going to identify these three brackets over here, the three main components of a long bone. This middle bracket right over here, this makes up what's called the shaft of the bone, but more specifically, its title is the bone's diaphysis. Okay, so the diaphysis makes up this middle shaft. And then we got two different ends over here, and both of the ends are called the same thing, but we got to use our directional terms in order to identify which is which. So both of these ends are called epiphyses, or singular epiphysis, but this one up here is called the proximal epiphysis. There we go. Epiphysis. Proximal epiphysis. Yeah, and you got to learn how to say that. It's a tricky pronunciation. It's like a tongue twister, but you get used to it after a while. So that's called the proximal epiphysis. Why is it called proximal? Well, it's because it's right here. And if it's closer towards the point of attachment to the torso, it's proximal, right? So that would make this the distal epiphysis. There we go. All right, so there's the distal epiphysis and the proximal epiphysis. So now what we're going to look at are those layers that we kind of pointed out before. If you check out the kind of bluish layer, it's kind of another component that we really didn't discuss on the last page, but it can be very, very important. An extremely important component of the skeletal system is not just bone, but it's actually cartilage too, and we're going to talk about that more later on as well. So this blue stuff right down here and kind of lining the top of this proximal epiphysis, this is what we call articular cartilage. And articular cartilage covers the ends of long bones, and their idea is to kind of reduce the friction between joints, right? So imagine bone grinding on bone. I mean, maybe some of you don't even have to imagine based on injuries to cartilage, or maybe you've had family members with issues like that. But articular cartilage at the end of long bones kind of makes for like frictionless or low friction, smooth movements between joints. Thank goodness for that. All right, so there's articular cartilage. Moving on up here, this is our spongy bone. And spongy bone we can find in greater concentrations at the epiphyses and less really so in the diaphysis, although you still can find spongy bone in the diaphysis. It's right where we said it was. It's right deep to the compact bone, which is what we should point out next, isn't it? So right here is the compact bone. All right, there. As we can see, it is compact. There's not holes in it, and it is superficial to the spongy bone. Okay, and then we're kind of skipping around just a little bit. If we look at this arrow over here, it is referring to the outer covering, which we discussed before is called the periosteum. Periosteum, peri meaning around, osteum meaning bone. And then this innermost layer right here with this yellow stuff kind of coming in between, this is called the medullary cavity. Medullary is referring to the middle. So this is the innermost part of the bone. This is what holds the yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is a nice deposit for our bodies and for fat and other different energy-rich molecules. All right, so there's the medullary cavity, and what this last arrow is referring to is kind of this thin band near the proximal epiphysis. And it's kind of embedded right in between these two areas of spongy bone here, but it's not spongy bone and it's not compact bone. It's actually cartilage. It is what is called the epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal plate. And so, where have you heard plate before when it comes to bones and when it comes to growing? Well, you've heard of the growth plate. So the epiphyseal plate is actually cartilage that will eventually become bone as you grow. So in an adult, we no longer have cartilage at the ends of our long bones, and thus we're not growing anymore. So we don't have that cartilage epiphyseal plate anymore. But if you're, still growing, you're still a kid, you've got a nice layer of cartilage right here that's going to expand and allow you to grow to be 6 feet tall. All right. So that will be it for this video. Again, this is also some kind of stuff that we already talked about. The epiphysis is the end, the diaphysis is the shaft, articular cartilage. It's made of a cartilage called hyaline cartilage. It provides padding and smooth joint motion. The periosteum is the membrane that covers the entire bone, and the medullary cavity is the innermost part of the bone, and it contains the yellow bone marrow. All right, yes, that is it. I just wanted to double check. So in our next video, we're going to get into ossification and remodeling and how does bone grow and function. All right, let me know if you have any questions. We'll see you next time.